California, September 1944. The desert heat shimmered off the asphalt as the convoy of olive-green trucks wound through the barren hills east of Los Angeles. Inside the lead vehicle, Hans Müller pressed his face against the small window, watching the alien landscape roll past, endless brown mountains dotted with strange spiky plants unlike anything in his native Bavaria. The 27-year-old former Wehrmacht sergeant shifted uncomfortably on the hard bench, his wooden crutches sliding against his good leg as the truck hit another pothole. 6 months had passed since the American shell fragment had torn through his right leg below the knee during the chaotic retreat from Normandy, and Hans had grown accustomed to the constant dull ache where his limb used to be. The other 11 German prisoners in the truck shared his mixture of anxiety and exhaustion. There was Klaus Brenner, a former panzer commander who had lost his left arm to a bazooka blast near Caen. Friedrich Weber, a Luftwaffe pilot, whose right hand had been mangled beyond repair when his Messerschmitt crashed in the French countryside. And young Otto Steinbach, barely 22, who sat quietly in the corner with both legs ending at the knee, a victim of a mine explosion during the desperate defense of Saint-Vite. They had all survived the overcrowded prisoner transport ships, the interrogation camps, and months of uncertainty about their fate. Now, as their convoy approached what the Americans called a special rehabilitation facility, Hans wondered if this was where their captors would finally dispose of them before continuing. Subscribe and hit the bell. Here, we retell the forgotten human stories of war. The truck began to slow, and Hans could see gates ahead. Not the forbidding barbed wire and guard towers he had expected, but a simple entrance marked by a wooden sign reading U.S. Army Medical Rehabilitation Center. Palm trees lined the road, their fronds rustling in the warm September breeze. Beyond the gates, Hans glimpsed not concrete bunkers or prison barracks, but low, cream-colored buildings that looked more like a California resort than a prisoner-of-war camp. The architecture was Spanish colonial style, with red tile roofs and arched doorways, surrounded by carefully maintained gardens where sprinklers cast rainbow mists over green lawns. As the truck rumbled through the gates and came to a stop in a circular driveway, Hans felt his heart pounding. Through the rear canvas, he could hear American voices, but they sounded professional, almost clinical, rather than harsh or threatening. The tailgate dropped with a metallic clang, and bright sunlight flooded the truck bed. A young U.S. Army medic appeared, his uniform crisp and clean, wearing a genuine smile that seemed impossible in Hans's experience of American captivity. "Gentlemen, welcome to the Rehabilitation Center," the medic said in careful, accented German, extending his hand to help Hans down from the truck. "I'm Corporal Martinez. We're here to help you learn to walk again." Hans stared at the offered hand, certain this was some kind of cruel joke. In his months as a prisoner, he had been processed, interrogated, and transported, but never welcomed, never helped. The medic's expression remained patient and kind as Hans tentatively accepted the assistance, carefully maneuvering his wooden crutches as he stepped down onto the warm asphalt. The California sun blazed overhead, but the heat felt different from the oppressive atmosphere of the transport camps Hans had endured. There was something clean about this place, something hopeful. As he and his fellow amputees gathered in the driveway, Hans noticed other German prisoners moving around the facility, but these men were walking on artificial limbs, working in gardens, sitting at tables playing cards. They looked healthy, even content. Their uniforms were clean, their faces showed no signs of malnutrition or abuse, and most remarkably, they were laughing and talking with American staff members as if they were colleagues rather than enemies. The sound of hammering and sawing echoed from a large workshop building, mixed with voices speaking in a mixture of German and English. An American officer approached the new arrivals, his clipboard tucked under his arm, his manner professional but not intimidating. Lieutenant Colonel William Hayes was a career Army doctor who had volunteered to run this experimental program, believing that proper treatment of wounded prisoners was both a moral obligation and a practical necessity for post-war reconstruction. "I know this must seem strange to you," Colonel Hayes said through his German interpreter, a middle-aged prisoner named Johann, who had been a university professor before the war. "You were expecting harsh treatment, perhaps punishment for your service against America. Instead, we're going to give you something your own army never provided, the chance to rebuild your lives with dignity." He paused, letting the words sink in. "This facility exists because we believe that healing doesn't recognize nationality, and that every man, regardless of the uniform he once wore, deserves the opportunity to walk with pride." Hans listened to these words with growing amazement. In the Wehrmacht medical system, amputee soldiers were often written off as burdens, given minimal treatment and relegated to rear area duties or medical discharge. The concept of extensive rehabilitation, of custom prosthetics designed for individual needs, was almost foreign to German military medicine. Yet here was an American colonel speaking of dignity and pride, of rebuilding lives rather than simply maintaining existence. As the new arrivals were led toward the processing building, Hans observed the facility more carefully. The workshops were modern and well-equipped, with American technicians working alongside German prisoners to craft artificial limbs. The medical buildings contained examination rooms that looked more advanced than many German military hospitals. The living quarters were clean dormitories rather than prison cells, with real beds, reading lamps, and lockers for personal belongings. Most remarkably, there was a sense of purpose and activity everywhere. Men learning to walk, practicing with prosthetic arms, working on mechanical projects, attending classes in English and vocational skills. "Müller, Hans," called out Lieutenant David Peterson, a young American officer checking his clipboard. Peterson had volunteered for this assignment, partly because his own brother had lost a leg serving with Patton's Third Army, and he understood the psychological impact of limb loss. His tone was professional, but carried an undertone of genuine concern. Hans nodded, expecting orders to march somewhere, but instead Peterson gestured toward a nearby medical building. "Dr. Thompson wants to examine your residual limb. We're going to fit you with a proper prosthetic." Hans stared at the lieutenant, certain he had misunderstood the English. Peterson noticed his confusion and switched to the broken German he had learned specifically for this assignment. "Neues Bein, new leg, for walking, good walking." The words hung in the desert air like an impossible promise, a concept so foreign to Hans's expectations that he struggled to process their meaning. After months of being told he was a burden, a crippled enemy to be minimally maintained until the abstract end of the war, the idea that Americans would invest time, skill, and resources in restoring his mobility seemed like a dream from which he might wake at any moment. As Hans was helped toward the medical building, leaning heavily on his crutches, he passed a window where he could see into one of the workshops. Inside, an American craftsman with graying hair and careful hands was fitting a prosthetic leg to a German prisoner Hans recognized from the transport. The American was adjusting straps and padding with the patience of a master artisan, explaining something in broken German while the prisoner nodded eagerly. When the German man stood and took his first tentative steps on the artificial limb, both he and the American craftsman smiled broadly, and Hans saw something he had not witnessed in over a year of war and captivity. Two former enemies sharing a moment of purely human joy in the restoration of hope. The next morning, Hans was awakened not by harsh commands or whistle blasts, but by the gentle sound of his dormitory neighbor, Klaus Brenner, attempting to button his shirt with his one remaining hand. The early California sun streamed through clean windows, illuminating a room that defied every expectation Hans had developed about American prisoner-of-war facilities. The beds had real mattresses and pillows. The floors were clean linoleum rather than dirt or concrete, and each man had a small metal locker for personal belongings. a luxury Hans had not experienced since his last leave in Munich over a year ago. After a breakfast that included real eggs, fresh bread, and coffee that actually tasted like coffee rather than Ersatzgrain, Hans was escorted to the prosthetics workshop by Sergeant First Class Michael O'Brien, a stocky Irish-American craftsman whose father had lost his own leg in the Great War. O'Brien had volunteered for this assignment because he understood intimately the psychological devastation that accompanied limb loss, having watched his father struggle with both the physical challenges of amputation and the emotional burden of feeling useless to his family and community. Inside the workshop, Hans discovered a world that challenged everything he thought he knew about American attitudes toward German prisoners. The building was large and airy, with skylights that provided natural illumination for detailed work. American craftsmen worked alongside German prisoners, measuring, cutting, shaping, and assembling artificial limbs with the precision and care of master furniture makers. The room smelled of fresh wood shavings, leather conditioner, metal polish, and something Hans had almost forgotten existed: the scent of purposeful, creative work. Hans watched in fascination as Klaus Brenner tested his newly completed prosthetic arm, a marvel of engineering that combined lightweight wood construction with metal joints and leather strapping. The artificial limb was far more sophisticated than anything Hans had seen in German military hospitals. It featured a jointed elbow, a wrist that could rotate, and fingers that could be positioned for different gripping tasks. Klaus carefully practiced picking up objects of different sizes and weights: a pencil, a coffee cup, a wrench, a book. When he successfully lifted the coffee cup to his lips and took a sip without spilling, the entire workshop erupted in applause. Americans and Germans celebrating together as if Klaus were a beloved teammate rather than a former enemy. Klaus's face, weathered by years of tank warfare and months of imprisonment, was streaked with tears. "Ich kann wieder arbeiten," he whispered to Hans in amazement. "I can work again." The prosthetic would allow him to return to his pre-war profession as a machinist, to provide for his family, to feel useful again, rather than like a burden to be pitied. Hans realized that Klaus was crying not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of having his future restored by people who had every reason to hate him. Dr. Robert Thompson, the civilian contractor who served as the facility's chief prosthetist, examined Hans's healing stump with hands that were both gentle and expertly professional. Dr. Thompson had been working with amputees since 1918, had seen thousands of men struggle with the transition from whole to incomplete, and had dedicated his career to developing better techniques for restoring function and dignity to the wounded. His examination was thorough but painless, checking the condition of Hans's remaining tissue, testing the strength and flexibility of his residual muscles, and measuring the precise dimensions needed for a custom prosthetic. "Excellent tissue healing," Dr. Thompson murmured to his assistant, making detailed notes on Hans's chart. "Good muscle tone, no signs of infection or complications. We can definitely work with this." Through Johann, the professor who served as translator, Dr. Thompson explained that Hans would receive not just any artificial leg, but one specifically designed for his body measurements, his activity level, and his planned post-war occupation. "You were a mechanic before the war?" the doctor asked, consulting Hans's file, which had been compiled from interrogation records and interviews. "Then you'll need something sturdy enough for standing at workbenches, flexible enough for kneeling and crouching, and precise enough for detailed work." Hans could barely process the implications of Dr. Thompson's words. In Germany, wounded soldiers were typically given basic, standardized prosthetics, functional but crude devices designed more for appearance than for actual utility. The idea that Americans would invest the time and resources to create a custom artificial limb specifically suited to his individual needs and career goals seemed impossible. Yet here was this elderly American doctor speaking with genuine enthusiasm about restoring Hans not just to basic mobility, but to skilled, productive work. The workshop itself was a testament to American industrial capacity and organizational skill. Hans observed workstations equipped with precision tools he had only seen in the finest German machine shops, lathes for shaping wooden components, leatherworking equipment for creating comfortable padding and strapping, metalworking tools for crafting joints and hardware, and measuring devices accurate to fractions of inches. The Americans had established an entire production system dedicated to creating prosthetics for enemy wounded, a concept so foreign to Hans's understanding of warfare that he struggled to believe what he was witnessing. Sergeant O'Brien began explaining the process of creating Hans's prosthetic using a mixture of English, broken German, and universal gestures. First, they would create a detailed cast of his residual limb to ensure a perfect fit. Then they would construct the socket, the part that would interface directly with his body, using the finest materials available, specially selected wood, high-quality leather, and metal fittings manufactured to precise tolerances. The foot would be carved from a single piece of hardwood and shaped to match Hans's remaining foot as closely as possible. The ankle joint would be engineered to provide natural flexibility for walking on uneven surfaces. "Every man deserves to walk with dignity," O'Brien told Johann, who translated the message for Hans. The American sergeant's own father had struggled with a crude wooden peg leg after the previous war, and O'Brien was determined that this generation of amputees would receive better treatment. As O'Brien carefully selected the piece of wood that would become Hans's artificial foot, examining the grain and testing the strength, Hans realized that this American stranger was investing more personal attention and professional skill in his prosthetic than many German doctors had spent on treating wounded Wehrmacht soldiers. Hans spent the morning observing the workshop's operations, amazed by the level of cooperation between American staff and German prisoners. Language barriers were overcome through patience, gestures, and the gradual development of a hybrid vocabulary that both sides could understand. German prisoners who had received prosthetics early in the program now worked as assistants and translators, helping newly arrived amputees adjust to the rehabilitation process. The atmosphere was one of shared purpose rather than guard-prisoner tension. Everyone in the workshop was working toward the common goal of restoring function and dignity to men who had been broken by war. During lunch in the facility's dining hall, Hans sat with other recent arrivals and listened to the experiences of German prisoners who had been at the center for several months. They spoke of American staff members who had learned German phrases to communicate better with patients, of workshop supervisors who praised good craftsmanship regardless of the craftsman's nationality, of doctors who stayed late to ensure that prosthetic fittings were perfect. Most remarkably, they spoke of being treated not as conquered enemies to be punished, but as human beings deserving of care and respect. Friedrich Weber, the former Luftwaffe pilot whose mangled hand was being fitted with an artificial replacement, described his amazement at the prosthetic's sophistication. "They're making me fingers that can move independently," he told Hans in wonderment. "Not just a simple hook, but actual fingers with joints. The American technician told me I'll be able to write, to use tools, even to play piano again if I practice." Friedrich's artificial hand would feature individually articulated fingers controlled by cables connected to wrist and forearm movements, a level of engineering sophistication that impressed even experienced German mechanics. As the afternoon wore on and Hans returned to the workshop to begin the casting process for his prosthetic, he found himself thinking about his wife Martha and their 2 young children back in Bavaria. His last letter home, written from the interrogation camp months ago, had been filled with despair and resignation. He had told Martha to prepare for life as a widow, to raise their children with the understanding that their father would never again be able to provide for them properly. Now, watching American craftsmen work with dedicated precision on artificial limbs that would restore not just mobility but livelihood to former enemies, Hans began to imagine a different future, one where he might return home not as a burden, but as a man capable of rebuilding his family's life. Now tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day this story found you. It's curious to know how far these human memories travel. 3 weeks later, Hans woke before dawn in his dormitory bed, unable to sleep from anticipation. Today was the day Dr. Thompson and Sergeant O'Brien would fit him with his completed prosthetic, the artificial leg that had been crafted specifically for his measurements, his needs, and his future. Through the window, he could see the workshop lights already glowing in the early morning darkness, where American technicians had arrived early to make final adjustments to the prosthetics scheduled for fitting that day. The dining hall buzzed with quiet excitement during breakfast. Klaus Brenner, now proficient with his prosthetic arm, cut his pancakes with one hand while offering encouragement to Hans and the other men scheduled for fittings. Friedrich Weber demonstrated how his new artificial fingers could pick up his coffee cup, manipulate utensils, and even sign his name with a pen, movements that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Otto Steinbach, the young soldier who had lost both legs, rolled his wheelchair over to Hans's table to share advice about the psychological adjustment that would follow the physical fitting. "The first step is the hardest," Otto said quietly, speaking from his experience with bilateral prosthetics. "Not because of pain or difficulty, but because you suddenly realize that your life isn't over. That these Americans have given you back possibilities you thought were gone forever." Otto had been scheduled to receive his own prosthetics the following week, custom-designed legs that would allow him to walk again despite losing both limbs above the knee. The engineering required for his prosthetics was even more complex than Hans's, involving hip joints, knee mechanisms, and sophisticated harness systems to distribute weight properly. At 9 o'clock sharp, Hans presented himself at the prosthetics fitting room, a clean, well-lit space equipped with parallel bars, mirrors, and adjustment tools. Dr. Thompson and Sergeant O'Brien were waiting for him, along with Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, the physical therapist who would guide Hans through the process of learning to walk naturally again. Lieutenant Martinez had volunteered for the program after her younger brother lost an arm, serving with the Pacific Fleet, and she understood better than most that successful prosthetic use required not just mechanical fitting, but psychological adjustment and patient training. The artificial leg they presented to Hans was a marvel of craftsmanship that exceeded his wildest expectations. Instead of the crude wooden peg he had imagined, Hans was looking at a precisely engineered device that had been shaped, carved and assembled with the care of a fine musical instrument. The wooden foot was anatomically correct, complete with shaped toes and a natural arch. The ankle joint moved smoothly and would allow him to walk on uneven surfaces. The leather padding was soft and precisely fitted to the contours of his residual limb. Metal hardware had been polished to a mirror finish. Every component showed evidence of hours of careful work by skilled craftsmen who had invested their professional pride in creating the best possible result. "This is for me?" Hans asked in German, his voice barely above a whisper. The question was translated for Dr. Thompson, who smiled and nodded. "Made specifically for Hans Müller, former mechanic from Bavaria, future mechanic wherever life takes him," the doctor replied through Johann. The personalization of the prosthetic, the understanding that it had been created not for some generic amputee, but for him individually, overwhelmed Hans with emotions he had not felt since before the war: gratitude, hope, and the possibility of a future worth living. The fitting process began with careful attachment of the prosthetic to Hans's residual limb. Dr. Thompson and Sergeant O'Brien worked together with the patience of master craftsmen, adjusting straps and padding until the artificial leg felt secure but comfortable. They explained each step of the process, checked for pressure points that might cause discomfort, and made small modifications to ensure perfect fit. Hans realized that these Americans were taking more care with his prosthetic fitting than German military doctors had taken with treating his original wound. "Try putting some weight on it," Dr. Thompson encouraged through the translator. Hans gripped the parallel bars and slowly shifted his weight onto his new leg. The prosthetic held firm, the padding distributing pressure evenly across his residual limb. For the first time since the shell fragment had torn through his leg in Normandy, Hans stood on 2 feet. The physical sensation was remarkable, not the crude, unbalanced feeling he had expected from an artificial limb, but something approaching natural stability. But the emotional impact was even more profound. For 6 months, Hans had been half a man, dependent on crutches, unable to stand with dignity or walk with confidence. In the space of a few seconds, he had been restored to wholeness. Not the same wholeness he had possessed before his wound. The prosthetic would never be exactly like his original leg, but a new kind of completeness that allowed him to stand tall, to look people in the eye as an equal, rather than looking up at them from a position of disability and dependence. Lieutenant Martinez began working with Hans immediately, teaching him the mechanics of walking with a prosthetic limb. She had studied the latest techniques in amputee rehabilitation, drawing on medical advances developed for treating American wounded and adapting them for use with German prisoners. Her approach emphasized gradual progression, building confidence alongside physical skill, and treating each patient as an individual with specific needs and goals, rather than as a case to be processed. "Kleine Schritte," she said in her carefully practiced German, guiding Hans as he took his first tentative steps between the parallel bars. "Small steps. Don't try to walk normally yet. Just get used to the feeling." Her pronunciation was distinctly American, but her patience and encouragement transcended language barriers. Hans could see that Lieutenant Martinez genuinely cared about his progress, that she took professional pride in helping him regain mobility, and that she treated him not as an enemy prisoner, but as a patient deserving of her best efforts. The first day of walking practice was exhausting but exhilarating. Hans managed only a few steps at a time before needing to rest, his remaining leg muscles working harder than they had in months, his balance challenged by the different mechanics of prosthetic locomotion. But each step represented progress. Each successful movement across the parallel bars was a small victory that brought him closer to independence and dignity. During rest breaks, Hans observed other patients in various stages of prosthetic training. There was Werner Hoffmann, a former artillery sergeant who was learning to operate machinery with his new prosthetic arm. Max Richter, a young infantry soldier, practiced walking up and down stairs with his artificial leg. Johann Braun, a former U-boat crew member who had lost 3 fingers, worked on fine motor skills with his partial hand prosthetic. Each man was receiving individualized attention from American staff members who seemed genuinely invested in achieving the best possible outcomes. Over the following days, Hans's walking improved dramatically. Lieutenant Martinez gradually reduced his dependence on the parallel bars, teaching him to walk with a cane, then to walk short distances unaided. She showed him how to navigate stairs, how to maintain balance on uneven surfaces, and how to perform the daily activities that would be necessary for independent living. Most importantly, she helped him develop confidence in his prosthetic, teaching him to trust the artificial limb and to move with the natural gait that would allow him to blend seamlessly into civilian life after the war. The psychological impact of successful mobility was as significant as the physical achievement. Hans found himself standing straighter, making eye contact more readily, participating more actively in conversations with other prisoners and American staff. The restoration of his ability to walk had restored something more fundamental, his sense of himself as a complete human being capable of contributing meaningfully to the world around him. Dr. Thompson observed Hans's progress with professional satisfaction and personal pleasure. Each successful prosthetic fitting validated his belief that proper medical care should extend to all patients regardless of nationality or political affiliation. He took detailed notes on Hans's adaptation process, documenting techniques and modifications that could be applied to future cases. In his evening reports to the War Department, Dr. Thompson emphasized not just the humanitarian value of the program, but its practical benefits for post-war reconstruction. Men who returned to Germany with functional prosthetics and vocational skills would be better equipped to rebuild their country and less likely to harbor resentment against the Allied occupation. By the end of his second week of walking practice, Hans was able to move around the facility independently, climb stairs without assistance, and even jog short distances. His prosthetic had become not just a replacement for his lost limb, but a tool that enabled him to envision a productive future. When he caught sight of himself in the workshop mirrors, Hans saw not a crippled ex-soldier, but a man who could return to his family with dignity intact and skills restored. The American staff treated the German amputees not as enemy prisoners requiring minimal maintenance, but as patients deserving of the most advanced care available. They provided not just prosthetics, but comprehensive rehabilitation, including physical therapy, occupational training, psychological counseling through German-speaking chaplains, and even basic education in English and American vocational techniques. Hans began working in the facility's mechanical shop, his restored mobility allowing him to stand at workbenches, operate tools, and perform precision work that had been impossible while dependent on crutches. The American supervisors in the machine shop praised Hans's skill and attention to detail, treating him as a valuable craftsman rather than a conquered enemy performing forced labor. They showed him American techniques for metalworking and engine repair, skills that would make him more employable after the war. Most remarkably, they asked for his input on technical problems, consulting him as they would consult any experienced mechanic. For Hans, this restoration of professional respect was almost as important as the restoration of his physical mobility. As autumn settled over the California hills, Hans had become one of the facility's success stories, but more importantly, he had discovered something he never expected to find in enemy captivity: friendship that transcended nationality and ideology. His closest companion was Corporal James "Jimmy" Sullivan, a freckled Irish-American from Boston who had lost his left arm to German artillery during the Sicily campaign. Jimmy had been assigned to work with German amputees, partly as occupational therapy for his own psychological recovery, and partly because his working-class background and direct manner made him particularly effective at connecting with former enemy soldiers. Jimmy and Hans communicated through a mixture of broken English, fractured German, and the universal language of shared experience that exists among men who have lost pieces of themselves in war. They understood each other's phantom pain, the mysterious sensations that seemed to come from limbs that no longer existed. They shared the daily challenges of learning to perform routine tasks with artificial body parts. They both knew the psychological effort required to maintain optimism when forced to rebuild their lives around permanent disability. Their friendship had begun in the machine shop, where Jimmy supervised mechanical training for German amputees. Hans's skill with engines and precision work had impressed Jimmy immediately, and the American had begun seeking Hans's advice on technical problems that arose in the shop. Their conversations gradually expanded beyond work to include family, pre-war careers, shared interests in fishing and motorcycles, and the simple human connection that develops between men who respect each other's abilities and character. Jimmy taught Hans American card games during evening recreation periods, while Hans showed Jimmy German engineering techniques that could be applied to prosthetic modifications and mechanical repairs. Their partnership puzzled some observers, a former Wehrmacht sergeant and a US Army corporal, former enemies now sharing meals and comparing prosthetic adjustments as if they were old friends from the same hometown. But Dr. Thompson and the facility's other senior staff encouraged these relationships, understanding that healing often came through human connection rather than medical intervention alone. Pain doesn't recognize nationality, Dr. Thompson frequently told his staff during their weekly meetings. Neither should compassion. These men are learning that they have more in common with each other than they have differences. That understanding will serve everyone well when this war ends and the real work of building peace begins. The doctor had observed that patients who formed friendships across national lines recovered more quickly, adapted more successfully to their prosthetics, and displayed less resentment about their circumstances. The facility's success stories continued to accumulate throughout the fall of 1944. Friedrich Weber, the former Luftwaffe pilot, had not only learned to use his sophisticated prosthetic hand, but had begun teaching other amputees the techniques he had mastered. His artificial fingers, controlled by cables connected to wrist and forearm movements, allowed him to write legibly, operate machinery, and even play simple piano pieces on the old upright piano in the recreation hall. Friedrich's success inspired other patients and validated the American investment in high-quality prosthetics designed for individual needs. Otto Steinbach had received his bilateral leg prosthetics and was making remarkable progress learning to walk again. The engineering required for his dual artificial limbs was extraordinarily complex, involving hip joints that moved naturally, knee mechanisms that locked and unlocked automatically during the walking cycle, and a sophisticated harness system that distributed his body weight evenly across his torso. Otto's determination to master his prosthetics inspired everyone at the facility. Americans and Germans alike cheered his progress as he graduated from wheelchair to walker to canes to independent mobility. Each success reinforced the program's revolutionary approach, treating enemy wounded not as burdens to be minimally maintained until the war's end, but as human beings deserving of restoration and dignity. Hans witnessed moments that challenged everything he had been taught about American attitudes toward German prisoners. When elderly prisoner Wolfgang Krauss suffered a stroke during his third week at the facility, American doctors worked around the clock to save his life, providing the same level of neurological care they would have given their own soldiers. When young Peter Zimmermann, barely 19 and missing his right arm, suffered a psychological breakdown from despair about his future, American chaplains and German prisoners alike surrounded him with comfort and encouragement. These acts of mercy occurred not because of military orders or political directives, but because the Americans running the facility genuinely believed that healing was a universal human obligation that transcended nationality and military allegiance. Hans observed American staff members staying late to perfect prosthetic fittings, spending their own money to purchase small comforts for patients, and investing emotional energy in the recovery of men who had recently been trying to kill their countrymen. The commitment was both professional and personal, both systematic and heartfelt. Hans's friendship with Jimmy Sullivan deepened as they spent more time working together in the machine shop and socializing during off-duty hours. Jimmy had grown up in a working-class Irish neighborhood where men were judged by their skill and character rather than their politics or nationality. He evaluated Hans based on his craftsmanship, his work ethic, and his treatment of other people, criteria that made nationality irrelevant. Hans, in turn, appreciated Jimmy's direct honesty, his willingness to share technical knowledge, and his genuine interest in Hans's family and post-war plans. During long evening conversations on the facility's patio, watching the California sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple, Jimmy and Hans discussed their hopes for the future. Jimmy planned to return to Boston, where his family owned a small automotive repair shop, and he wanted to use his experience working with amputees to develop better adaptive tools for disabled mechanics. Hans dreamed of returning to Bavaria, rebuilding his own workshop, and perhaps developing some of the American techniques he had learned for use in post-war German reconstruction. "You know what's funny?" Jimmy said one evening, practicing his German pronunciation as he tried to communicate a complex idea. "If we'd met before the war, we probably would have been friends right away. Good mechanics understand each other, doesn't matter what language they speak." Hans nodded, understanding the sentiment even when Jimmy's German grammar was imperfect. They shared the craftsman's appreciation for precision, quality work, and practical problem-solving that transcended cultural and political differences. Their friendship became a model for other relationships developing at the facility. American staff members and German patients discovered common interests in music, sports, technical subjects, and family life that created bonds stronger than the divisions of war. The facility's recreation hall hosted evening programs where Germans and Americans played cards together, shared songs from their respective countries, and engaged in the kind of casual social interaction that was almost unimaginable in traditional prisoner-of-war camps. Dr. Thompson documented these relationships in his reports to the War Department, arguing that successful rehabilitation required not just medical treatment, but social integration. Patients who formed friendships with American staff and other patients recovered more quickly, adapted more successfully to civilian life, and were more likely to become positive influences in post-war reconstruction. The Prosthetics program was succeeding, not just as a medical initiative, but as a demonstration that former enemies could work together toward common goals when treated with mutual respect and dignity. Hans also formed close friendships with other German patients, particularly Klaus Brenner and Friedrich Weber, with whom he had arrived at the facility. The three men often worked together on mechanical projects, shared meals, and provided emotional support for each other during difficult moments in their recovery. Their bond was strengthened by shared experience of trauma, loss, and unexpected restoration, but also by their growing appreciation for the American approach to rehabilitation and their cautious optimism about post-war possibilities. As winter approached, Hans realized that his time at the facility was transforming not just his physical capabilities, but his understanding of human nature and international relations. He had arrived expecting punishment and had instead found compassion. He had anticipated minimal treatment and had received sophisticated medical care. He had assumed his usefulness was over and had discovered that Americans valued his skills and sought his expertise. Most importantly, he had learned that enemies could become friends when circumstances allowed people to see past uniforms and flags to the common humanity underneath. December 15th, 1944. The California winter was unlike anything Hans had experienced in Bavaria. Warm days, cool nights, and a clarity of sky that made the mountains seem close enough to touch. As he sat in the facility's library, a small but well-appointed room with books in both English and German, Hans struggled to find words that would explain his experience to his wife Martha back home in their bomb-damaged town near Munich. How could he describe receiving better medical care as a prisoner than many German soldiers received in their own military hospitals? How could he explain that American enemies had restored not just his leg, but his entire sense of human worth and future possibility? The letter he was writing would be his first communication with Martha since his initial prisoner-of-war notification months earlier. A brief, censored message that had simply confirmed his survival and capture. This letter would be different. This letter would attempt to describe a transformation so profound that Hans himself still struggled to believe it had actually happened. He had been given permission to write a longer, more detailed message, and American censors had promised to allow any content that focused on his medical treatment and rehabilitation rather than military information. "My dearest Martha," Hans finally began, his handwriting more legible than it had been in months, thanks to the fine motor skill exercises Lieutenant Martinez had taught him. "I am not the broken man I was when last I wrote to you. I am walking again, walking well, walking with dignity, walking toward a future I thought was lost forever. The Americans have given me an artificial leg that is better crafted than anything I have seen in German hospitals, better engineered than prosthetics I thought existed only in science fiction stories." He paused, looking out the library window at the workshop, where Sergeant O'Brien was fitting a prosthetic arm to a newly arrived German prisoner. The scene still seemed miraculous to Hans, an American craftsman investing hours of skilled labor in restoring function to an enemy soldier, working with the same care and precision he would bring to helping his own brother. How could he convey this level of unexpected mercy to Martha, who had been living under Allied bombing raids and probably harboring deep resentment against American airmen? Hans continued writing, describing the prosthetics workshop, the patient American staff, and his friendship with Jimmy Sullivan. The propaganda told us Americans were barbarians who would torture prisoners and use us as slave labor until we died from exhaustion and abuse, he wrote carefully, knowing that American censors would read these words, but hoping they would understand his message's purpose. Instead, I have found people who believe that every man, even an enemy, deserves to walk with dignity and work with purpose. Dr. Thompson, the civilian doctor who designed my prosthetic, tells me I will be able to return to mechanical work after the war, that my artificial leg will actually allow me to perform some tasks better than before because it will never tire or cause pain. He described his daily routine at the facility, morning exercises to maintain his strength and flexibility, work in the machine shop where American supervisors praised his craftsmanship and sought his advice on technical problems, afternoon sessions helping other German amputees learn to use their new prosthetics, and evening recreation periods where Germans and Americans played cards, shared songs, and talked about their families and post-war plans. The routine sounded almost peaceful, certainly more comfortable than what Martha was experiencing in war-torn Germany. "I work in their machine shop now, using American tools and techniques that are more advanced than what we had in Bavaria before the war," Hans wrote, his excitement about his restored professional capabilities evident in his careful script. "They treat me not as conquered enemy performing forced labor, but as a skilled craftsman whose expertise they value. Yesterday, the American supervisor asked my advice on repairing a complex engine problem. He consulted me as he would consult any experienced mechanic, seeking my input and praising my solution when it worked perfectly. I had forgotten what it felt like to be valued for my knowledge and skill, rather than feared for my nationality or pitied for my disability." Hans described the other German prisoners at the facility, men who had arrived as defeated, broken soldiers, and were being transformed into skilled craftsmen ready to contribute to post-war reconstruction. He wrote about Klaus Brenner's sophisticated prosthetic arm, about Friedrich Weber's artificial hand that could perform delicate tasks, about Otto Steinbach's bilateral leg prosthetics that had restored his mobility despite devastating injuries. Each success story represented not just individual healing, but proof that Americans were investing in Germany's human resources rather than simply punishing them for the war. "The most remarkable thing, Martha, is not the quality of the prosthetics or the advanced techniques they use, but the spirit in which they provide this care," Hans wrote, attempting to capture the emotional transformation he had experienced. "These people treat us with respect, with genuine concern for our welfare, with hope for our futures. When I expressed worry about being able to provide for our family after the war, Dr. Thompson spent an entire evening showing me American mechanical techniques that would make me more valuable as a skilled worker. When I mentioned our children, Lieutenant Martinez brought me photographs of prosthetics they had designed specifically for child amputees. promising that any of our family members who might need such help would receive the same care I have received. Hans wrote about the friendships he had formed with American staff members, particularly his growing closeness with Jimmy Sullivan. He described their shared interest in mechanical work, their evening conversations about family and future plans, and their mutual respect that had developed despite their recent status as enemies. Jimmy has invited me to visit his family's repair shop in Boston after the war, Hans wrote, still amazed by this gesture of friendship. He wants to learn more about German engineering techniques, and he wants to show me American innovations that might be useful when I rebuild my own workshop in Bavaria. We talk about starting a correspondence, about sharing technical knowledge, about maintaining a friendship that began in the strangest circumstances but has become one of the most valuable relationships of my life. The letter continued for several pages, Hans attempting to convey not just the facts of his treatment, but the emotional impact of discovering mercy where he had expected punishment, friendship where he had anticipated hatred, hope where he had resigned himself to despair. He wrote about small moments that had restored his faith in human nature, American nurses who learned German phrases to communicate better with patients, workshop supervisors who praised good craftsmanship regardless of the craftsman's nationality, doctors who stayed late to ensure that prosthetic fittings were perfect, chaplains who provided spiritual comfort without attempting religious conversion. Most importantly, Martha, they have given me back my future, Hans wrote as he approached the letter's conclusion. When I was wounded in Normandy, I believed my useful life was over. I thought I would return home as a burden to you and the children, unable to work, unable to provide, able only to accept charity and pity. Instead, these Americans have restored my capability to work, to contribute, to stand as an equal among skilled men. The prosthetic they have given me is not just a replacement for my lost leg. It is a tool that will allow me to rebuild our family's life with dignity and success. Hans sealed the letter with wax from a candle provided by the facility's German chaplain, a Lutheran minister who had volunteered to serve the spiritual needs of German prisoners throughout California. The chaplain had encouraged Hans to write honestly about his experiences, believing that such testimony might help German civilians understand that not all Americans were the monsters portrayed in Nazi propaganda. As Hans handed the sealed letter to an American mail clerk for processing and delivery, he felt he was sending more than just words to his wife. He was sending proof that healing and reconciliation were possible even in the midst of humanity's greatest conflicts. If this story moved you, leave a like. It helps Hans's story reach more people and remember what war tried to erase: humanity. That evening, Hans sat on the facility's patio with Jimmy Sullivan, Otto Steinbach, and Klaus Brenner, watching the California sunset paint the mountains in brilliant colors. They talked about their families, their plans for the post-war period, and the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Jimmy was teaching the Germans American slang expressions, while Hans helped Jimmy with German pronunciation. Otto practiced walking with his bilateral prosthetics, encouraging a newly arrived German amputee who was just beginning his rehabilitation journey. Dr. Thompson joined them briefly, checking on their progress and discussing refinements to their prosthetics that might be needed as they became more active. The doctor's satisfaction with the program's success was evident, but Hans sensed that the elderly American physician was motivated by more than professional pride. Dr. Thompson genuinely cared about each patient's recovery, invested emotional energy in their success, and seemed to understand that he was participating in something larger than individual medical treatment. He was helping to plant seeds of healing that might grow into post-war reconciliation between former enemies. On his final day at the facility, in late December 1944, Hans participated in a small ceremony where Dr. Thompson presented him with a certificate documenting his successful completion of prosthetic rehabilitation training. The document, written in both English and German, certified that Hans Müller had demonstrated proficiency in prosthetic use, had completed vocational training in advanced mechanical techniques, and was prepared to return to productive civilian life. More importantly, Hans was given a complete set of maintenance tools for his prosthetic, instruction manuals for adjustments and repairs, and contact information for American prosthetic suppliers who would continue to provide replacement parts and service after the war. Sergeant O'Brien approached Hans with a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Inside were precision mechanical tools of the highest quality, instruments Hans had admired in the workshop but never imagined owning himself. Attached was a note written in O'Brien's careful handwriting and translated into German by Johann. For your workshop in Bavaria, may you build things that bring joy instead of destruction, create beauty instead of weapons, and teach young men to use their hands for healing rather than harm. Hans wept then, not from sadness, but from gratitude so overwhelming that he could not contain it. These Americans, who had every reason to hate him, had chosen to heal rather than harm, to restore rather than destroy, to invest in his future rather than punish his past. The tools in his hands represented more than instruments for mechanical work. They were symbols of trust, friendship, and hope for a better world that could emerge from the ashes of the current conflict. Years later, in his rebuilt workshop in Bavaria, Hans would display those American tools prominently and tell customers about his artificial leg and the enemies who had created it with such care. He would explain how former adversaries had treated him with more compassion and professional respect than his own army had shown its wounded soldiers. "They gave me more than a leg and more than tools," he would say, demonstrating his prosthetics capabilities and the precision of his American instruments. "They gave me back my faith that people can choose mercy over hatred, even in the midst of history's greatest wars." Hans would use Sergeant O'Brien's tools daily for the rest of his working life, maintaining them with religious care and passing down their story to his children and grandchildren. The tools would serve as tangible reminders that healing hands could emerge even from the darkest conflicts, that professional pride could transcend national boundaries, and that individual acts of mercy could plant seeds of reconciliation that would bloom long after the guns fell silent. In his shop window, Hans would display a photograph of himself with Jimmy Sullivan, Dr. Thompson, Sergeant O'Brien, and his fellow German patients, former enemies who had become lifelong friends through the simple human act of caring for one another's pain. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which part touched you most, because sometimes peace begins when we remember the past with empathy.